Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, the co-director of the Institute. In the past few years, as CDR has evolved in the United States from the purely notional to contemplation of large-scale programs and projects, both the federal government as well as individual states have begun to contemplate their potential role in this enterprise. One of the states doing so now is West Virginia. Very recently, West Virginia University's Bridge Initiative for Science and Technology Policy, Leadership and Communication released a thoughtful report that's entitled Carbon Dioxide Removal in West Virginia. Among the bottom line conclusions of the report is that, quote, proactive policymaker and stakeholder actions to capture this burgeoning opportunity in the near term can place West Virginia in the lead of long-term carbon management markets. I'm pleased today to have several of the authors of this report join me to discuss its findings, including the potential benefits of a commitment to carbon dioxide removal in West Virginia, as well as some of the challenges of implementing CDR programs at the state level, many of which will be pertinent throughout the country. Joining me today are Dr. Joan Centrella, who is director of the West Virginia University Bridge Initiative, Dr. Edward Brostek, who is associate professor of biology at West Virginia University, Dr. Brooke Eastman, science policy fellow at the West Virginia University Bridge Initiative, Dr. Deborah D. Stein of the Science and Technology Policy Academy at WVU and Bridge Study Director, as well as Dr. Sam Taylor, who serves as Assistant Director, Strategic Partnerships and Technology at West Virginia University's Energy Institute. We will begin with brief interventions by several of our speakers on the report, followed by some initial questions by me, and then we'll move on to audience Q&A. So please feel free to start populating the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many questions as possible in our allotted hour. And with that, Joan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Will. Debbie's got the slides. So this is the seminar. Debbie, would you go to the page, please? So who we are. So Will has just introduced us. Let me just say, as the director, a few words about the Bridge Initiative. We've been around at WVU for about 3.5 years. Our purpose is to work with faculty and staff researchers across the campus to bring the research that we do to bear on our university's strong land grant mission. We want to be able to use the work that we do to serve the public good, to serve the greater good. And we're doing that, in this case, through policy options. We work with faculty and researchers to translate the work that they do into policy options. We integrate that with community engagement, and we have a positive feedback where we learn what really needs to be done out in the community, and that provides this positive feedback loop. Today, we're going to talk about the work we've done in the past couple of years on our study on carbon dioxide removal. And our first speaker, Debbie, is that you or is it Eddie? I'll hand it over to Debbie. You're muted, Debbie.
Yeah, so I'm going to provide an overview of the policy maker guide. So the question that we asked is, what actions, if any, should national, state, and local West Virginia policymakers take to enhance removal and storage of CO2 from the atmosphere to reduce climate variation, increase economic opportunities, and create jobs for West Virginians? The way we did this is through not only the knowledge and expertise of West Virginia University faculty and staff, but also through 3 stakeholder roundtables that we had on the draft version of the guide. So we incorporated that feedback, and the way we work is we present policy options, and then we ask the stakeholders, and these are like topic-based roundtables, to evaluate the policy options. So they make a lot of comments. We make a lot of changes in response to those comments. And then we ask them to prioritize them based on looking at 4 policy analysis criteria, which are effectiveness, the likelihood of reaching the societal goal, efficiency, which is what will get the best bang for the buck, equity, looking at who is the winners and losers, the fairness of the policy, and ease of political acceptability. And based on those 4 criteria, we go from about, say, 20 policy options to about 10 recommendations. And it's those recommendations that we'll be talking about in this policymaker guide in this presentation. So the overall conclusion of this deliberation was that CDR, carbon dioxide removal, has the potential to bring economic growth to West Virginia. And as I imagine you know, West Virginia is not a particularly well-off state, and so this is always a very important criteria. The CO2 is removed. The CO2 is already in the atmosphere, and then it can be. There's 3 different ways that it can be taken out of that atmosphere. One are the natural methods, include forest, agriculture, and wetlands. West Virginia does have inland wetlands that are very important. Then there's also technologically enhanced methods. And in this case, we're looking at bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And then there's technological options, which include direct air capture. We found that West Virginia, because of its natural resources, is well suited for CDR, particularly in the case of its forest, and that its geology can potentially store CO2 in former oil and gas reservoirs, unminable coal seams, and saline formations. So if you look at this graphic, you'll see that on the y-axis there, we have how much CO2 could be removed annually by 2050 through these various methods. So we have the existing sinks, the existing forest and existing wetlands. And then there's additional activities that we could do to manage the other natural sinks, which include forest management, agriculture management, reforestation of abandoned mine lands, and wetland restoration. Then here you'll see information about the second category, the ones that are technologically enhanced. In this case, on the left, you'll see bioenergy, which would generate electricity. This is using wood waste from the timber industry in West Virginia. And on the right, you're going to see bioenergy going instead to liquid fuels. And then this is the potential for direct air capture. It's important to note here that the way we decided to focus this analysis is only on southern West Virginia. As Sam will talk about later, this is because that is the most economically disadvantaged part of West Virginia, and also happens to be a place where there's carbon storage, which also is important in reducing the need to transport CO2. Putting all this information, you'll see that our key findings recommendations that it's possible to create carbon opportunities in West Virginia, carbon reduction opportunities, to restore that carbon into West Virginia's natural resources, to benefit West Virginia's economic prosperity and create jobs for West Virginians. We can open these CDR opportunities while protecting West Virginia's ecology, conservation, economy, and the environment, and at the same time nurturing West Virginia's disadvantaged communities. So on the table that you see on the right, we sort of put all this information together. So you'll see we have the 3 CDR methods in the first column. In the second column, this is the range that we have in terms of how much CDR could be reduced per year by 2050. One thing we like to emphasize is that these are in increasing ranges of uncertainty. We have the most certainty with natural methods because we've been using that for a long time. We have about moderate uncertainty with bioenergy. And then we have the most uncertainty with direct air capture. Then we did the cost estimate of these. And the reason some of these decrease, this is based on Lawrence Livermore analysis, is from learning related to technology. So the presumption is that the price of those technologies will decrease. And then we'll have the annual investment that would be needed for each of these to be put into place in West Virginia. So when we take those figures about the annual investment, we put those in an economic model, and then we can determine the direct and indirect impacts and the total economic impacts for each of these different methods. So you'll see here, we can see how many jobs based on economic model that would be created for natural carbon sequestration, and the economic impact in terms of the economy, like, for example, not only the income from labor, but also from taxes. Then you'll see direct air capture, and also biomass to electricity and biomass to fuels. All these estimates were developed by a part of West Virginia that West Virginia University called the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, who does this economic modeling frequently for West Virginia General and particularly for the West Virginia legislature. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who's going to talk about direct air capture.
All right, thanks, Debbie. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks, Will, for having us today. So I want to talk about a couple different aspects of the study here, sort of high level. We'll talk a bit about the difficulties in finding good storage targets in West Virginia, a little about the economic, we'll call it conditions. We use incentives here, but there are some of the economic conditions and some community conditions that we've got to address to get projects like this done and to take risk out of those processes. We'll touch a bit about the standards for carbon accounting, and then we'll get into what's a big topic for West Virginia. How do you protect the interests and the engagement of local communities? Okay, thanks, Debbie. So a big one for us in West Virginia is the geology here is very complex. The folds of the Appalachian Mountains mean that where you have storage, you can move a few miles away and maybe you don't. And so that means that just about any project you're going to do, whether it's for CDR or for point source capture or otherwise, means that you're going to have to get out and do further study and maybe exploratory drilling to verify that you have a project in the place that you wanted. As was kind of alluded to at the top, we did focus in Southern West Virginia for this study, and we'll talk about that a little more in a second. But in the screening we did here, one of the other things we were looking at overlaps with some other work we have going with Coalfield Development Corporation, where we're trying to repurpose former mine sites, former surface mine sites, of which there are some pretty extensive complexes in Southern West Virginia. And it also helps us to drive investment and activity into a part of the state that's been hit pretty hard with energy transitions over the last decade. So the combination of looking for large scale surface sites with direct air capture, you're going to have a pretty big surface footprint. Work with the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey on, do we have kind of verifiable storage targets underneath these, and can we find an overlap? So our targets here were at least 30 million tons of storage total, and at least 100 acres of surface. And can we find places that overlap? And the short answer is we can. That's not a full feasibility study. That's not a feed or a pre-feed, but it's enough to say, okay, we take a deeper look at this. We can maybe do some further work and understand if there's a real opportunity for investment here. The other thing that's pretty exciting about direct air capture from our perspective, unlike maybe some of the other capture technologies, is it is, with the constraint of storage, it's location flexible. I don't have to install the capture equipment at some other existing facility, and I can start to simplify the discussion about pipeline transport and these kinds of things. So that's one of the reasons we were really attracted to this concept for the southern part of the state, because it lets us do a rare thing in economic development, which is put the thing where you need it, not necessarily where other things are happening. All right, Debbie. So when I talk a little bit about the conditions and the incentives you need, so in some of these things, again, when we were working on this study, a lot of the recent federal funding opportunities that have come out and some of the large bills had not passed at the writing of some of this. So when we were talking about it's expensive and the costs are high, that may have been before the federal government decided to put billions of dollars into direct air capture hubs. But still recognizing that it's a highly capital intensive project. And also in West Virginia, this is an interesting kind of tension point for us. For projects of this scale, many of the recent announcements are, TRL 6 and 7 and 50% cost share. And that's a tall bar for our communities and for organizations in this state. So WVU, has the capability to do these kinds of projects, but we're not a concrete and steel, capital construction project kind of outfit. And so finding who can run and how you put together projects that can, credibly access, $1 billion of federal investment with $1 billion of match, and can then deploy that is a tricky thing for us. One other reason we were interested in Southern West Virginia is a lot of industrial activity in Northern West Virginia. And so we expect there could be competition for pore space, again, recognizing complex geology. There could be more competition for that storage space in Northern West Virginia than Southern West Virginia. So again, this is starting to let us drive the activity where we want it in a sense, and bring some job creation and economic activity into the region. One other thing that's important to think about as you think about the long run economic impacts of these things, many of these communities, especially the former coal impacted communities, a lot of their community revenue came from severance taxes on coal extraction and other resource extraction. And so this lets you bring something that has kind of a steady long-term revenue stream into the community as you think about the fees or the taxes for carbon storage. All right, Devin. So this one's an interesting one. So while measuring the CO2 you inject, at least for a direct air capture project, is relatively straightforward, we can measure how many tons of CO2 were injected into the ground. There's not really a standard accounting for what a carbon credit is. There are some things through the IRS, through the 45Q and some of the other carbon tax credits that are starting to formalize that a little bit for projects like DAC. Eddie will talk a little more about how tricky that might be in some of the more biologic areas. There was another question that always comes up around significant zero carbon energy to be net carbon negative. So for us currently, renewables deployment in West Virginia lags the country, but that is one of the upsides of finding these large surface sites that have a lot of real estate potentially. You could install solar as needed. We also have a pretty robust research program going here at WVU looking at the opportunities for geothermal and whether or not you could use geothermal resources for regeneration of your capture system. So we've got a few angles that we're at least interested in and continuing to investigate for this project. All right. And then the bigger question as you get into these things is, how can you protect the interest and engagement of local communities? I'm a West Virginia native. This picture is of the main street of my hometown in central West Virginia. And, these communities are tight knit. Folks they live here because they want to live here. And so you do get into some interesting tensions on economic opportunity, job creation, and then concerns about environmental impact and truck traffic and these kinds of things. The idea with this project, again, in terms of targeting development in a place where we know we need it, is meant to try to address some of that, to bring high-tech jobs with long runways on them into a region that's been tough to target those kinds of investments into, just because of geography. It's hilly, it can be remote, it can be isolated, and you run into just infrastructure and getting there problems. So it becomes an interesting approach for some of these. That said, I mean, you have to take the impacts of a project. These are billion-dollar capital projects. So understanding how you engage with the community, how you protect drinking water, how you protect any kind of surface impacts, trying to target sort of brownfield former mine site for the development versus greenfield. Those are all some things we're trying to do in the development of these concepts and trying to bring industrial partners to the neighborhood. But thinking how you can co-optimize the benefits for your community and the environment and show benefits to external investors and to corporate partners. It's a tricky dance, but it's one we embrace, and it's one that we think has some opportunity and some legs here. So I think I'll check up there, and yep, perfect, because I'm not a biologist.
All right, I had to unmute there. And so for our natural CDR solutions, we mostly focused on forests because our policy recommendations, because the West Virginia is 75% forest. We are the third most forested state in the country. And forests are, it's the dominant land use over our landscape. And so one of our first policy recommendations is to invest in resources that provide technical assistance and advice to small forest owners. And I'll talk about this when we in the next slides, but most of the carbon credits so far have been going to large landowners, and they haven't, that benefit hasn't trickled down to these small family forest owners. The second one involves incentivizing the forest products industry to get into the carbon credit industry. And a lot of this lies in, there's a tension between timber production and carbon credit production. So how do we get the buy-in from the forest products industry? The third one deals with thinking about getting a nature-based carbon removal tax credit similar to the one that's 45Q that exists for technology solutions. And so can we get that same type of tax credit for natural CDR solutions? And then again, we're talking about standards. So in forests, it's tricky. We still don't have a great way to measure carbon uptake by a forest, and we still don't have a great way of predicting that carbon uptake into the future. And so we still need that basic research to figure out what are the actual carbon credits that are going to be produced through different management techniques. And then the final recommendation really lies in this tension between timber production and carbon credit generation. And so is there an optimal harvest cycle or an optimal management program that maximizes carbon removal, but also gives you that benefit of the forest products industry? All right, next slide. All right, so our first policy recommendation really focuses on these small family forest owners, and this reflects the fact that the majority of carbon credit projects in West Virginia are for large landholders. And this is, a lot of these are part of the California Air Regulatory Board market. And because of the initial investment costs that you need to do to get into those projects, it's really been limited to these large companies that have the money to put up the upfront cost. But if you look at West Virginia, we have 12 million acres of forest, and most of this is privately owned by families. And so how can we get them into these markets and let them also reap some of the economic benefits? And it might help them pay their property taxes or keep their forests in their family. And, this is really important because these small chunks of, not small, but these economic benefits can really help these people in these different, low-income environments. But we need to think about how can we reduce these technical and financial barriers for families to join the carbon market. And there's a big misconception that these carbon agreements are no-cut carbon agreements. And this was a big tension when we talked to some of the lawmakers down in the Capitol. That the forest products industry thinks that forest carbon credits are going to limit their ability to timber West Virginia forests, but in all actuality, you need to have a management plan that timbers the forest and actively manages the forest to show an additional carbon uptake over time. So all of these carbon credit agreements in forests involve active management that involves timbering. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, and so this one really focuses on, we went down to the West Virginia Capitol and we talked to some of the lawmakers, and there's a real concern that the carbon credit industry in forests could lock up land so that it won't be timbered in the future. And the forest products industry is concerned about their ability to have an economically viable industry in the state if carbon credits come in across a wide swath of forest. And this is important because that industry contributes a big chunk of change to the state's economy. And we need to find a way to get them to buy in, because right now they're not getting the economic benefit of making long-lived forest products like furniture, building materials, anything that's wood-related and sticks around for a long time, that's locking up carbon. And they're not actually seeing the economic benefit of that. It's the person who owns the forest that sees that. And so can we develop ways that we can incentivize them to get on board with this and realize that you can have a viable forest products industry and a forest carbon credit industry in the state? All right, next one. This third recommendation really lies in putting these natural climate carbon dioxide removal solutions into the same context as these more technologically based solutions like DAC. And so right now, the 45Q only really looks at these technological solutions like that and doesn't include nature-based carbon removal. So there are not credits for actively managing forests to increase carbon storage or performing regenerative agriculture to increase soil carbon or restoring wetlands. And so we have this recommendation that we also need a tax credit to promote these natural carbon dioxide removal solutions. All right, next one. All right, so these two are lumped onto the same one here. And this fourth one really leads to, there's been a lot of talk recently about whether carbon credit projects actually lead in forest, actually lead to actual carbon being stored in those ecosystems over long periods of time. And a lot of that reflects the fact that it's really hard to both measure carbon uptake by a forest. It's a little bit easier to do it above ground. Doing soils is incredibly hard to do because it's very variable. And then the models of what's going to happen, how you manage the forest and whether that leads to more carbon uptake over time, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so the projects like for the California Air Regulatory Board are 100-year agreements. And so they're modeling carbon uptake by the forest 100 years into the future. There is a lot of uncertainty involved in that. And we need to think about ways we can both verify these credits and better predict how management impacts forest carbon uptake over longer periods of time. And one other big thing missing from those most forest carbon projects is they only really think about above ground carbon. They neglect the fact that there's way more carbon in the soils. And if your management above ground could potentially lead to more carbon going to the soil, but could also potentially lead to more carbon losses. And then our final recommendation was this idea to request a study from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to see if we can find a way where we can optimize these harvest cycles for maximizing the carbon removal potential by forests and forest products. And so this is that idea, can we get this win-win? Can we keep a viable and economically beneficial forest products industry while at the same time also bringing in these economic benefits of carbon dioxide removal by forests? And so what we want to do here is think about what are the economic inputs to the forest products industry, think about how do landowners want to manage their lands. We talked to some landowners and they're really interested in this, and they are interested in keeping their forest in as a forest. And then there's also some other ecological considerations to think about with different management practices. How do they influence wildlife, erosion, flood control, all those different things. So there's potential negative and positive feedbacks of that management on the ecology of the area. I think that's all of mine.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I'm just going to start off with a couple of questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. And I want to start off with the political question, right? I mean, it's going to be a fascinating question and have different contexts in different states. But in a state like West Virginia, with a large commitment to fossil fuel production, as well as the interests of the forest industry, which you adverted to, I was wondering if you have a sense, Eddie and Sam, about what the political landscape looks like in West Virginia for CDR, maybe both in the legislature and in the executive branch at this point.
I can speak a little bit about the natural climate solutions, and Brooke can also jump in as well. So Brooke and I, and also another faculty member, Catherine Guzal, went down to the State House a couple months ago and met with some of our lawmakers in the House of Delegates because they were considering some limitations to forest carbon credit projects in the state. And from talking with them, a lot of it really deals with a lack of education on how these programs work. So they're under the perception that forest carbon credit projects are no-cut projects, when in fact, most of them involve timbering because you need to timber the landscape so that you reduce competition and increase above ground growth of the forest as a whole. So there's an education component. And then there's also because of that lack of kind of knowledge of the area, it leads to fear. And so there's this fear that carbon credit projects could lead to a large chunk of West Virginia land being locked up into these no-cut forest carbon credit projects that they can't use for other economic development or other uses. And so I think right now we're in the process of education and getting the information they need so they can make knowledgeable decisions. And in terms of the forest products industry, I think, and Brooke can speak to this, I think there's somewhat of a split. Some of them are for it and some of them are a little more against it. And there's some competing interests there. I don't know if you want to jump in real quick on that, Brooke.
Sure. Yeah, it's the major concern is coming from forest products industry that rely on procurement. So they go door to door, knocking on family forest owner homes, asking if they can cut on their land. And those are the same population that a lot of our policy recommendations are kind of targeting, is these small family forest owners who maybe aren't so interested in cutting down their forest, maybe want to do more management activities, increase recreation opportunities on their lands or other land uses. And so those are the folks that are worried that if the price of carbon credits or the rate of enrollment in these carbon programs gets too high, they might be limited in their supply of timber in the state. And then there's another kind of faction of industry, forest products industry that own these big swaths of land, these big corporations that kind of integrate carbon management and timber harvesting on their land. And so they're already kind of benefiting from both of those market options.
Is there a prospect, instead of it being a binary choice, is there a prospect of simply increasing forest stands in West Virginia as a way to both facilitate more carbon removal and ensure adequate supplies for the forest product industry?
So you're talking about like afforestation, like getting more forest?
Yeah.
I think we're pretty forested. So we're we have 75%. I don't think we can, there's some, if you looked at that first graph that Debbie showed, it showed, if we reforested abandoned coal mines, and there's a lot of abandoned coal mines, but they're a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the wide swath of existing forests we have. That is one of the most productive and carbon hungry forests in the world. So it's really about educating the forest products industry on management practices and timbering practices that they can still make money and generate carbon credits at the same time. And the bigger companies like Weyerhaeuser, there was just an article in the Wall Street Journal about this, they're integrating carbon removal into their business models. And so it needs to trickle down to the smaller forest products folks.
Yep.
And we should let Zane talk too at some point.
Well, and that's, ours was a whole different universe. I mean, it's the landscape for this sort of, point source geologic storage universe has changed astonishingly in 5 or 6 years. I mean, we've been involved in the last year or two on some of the policy making around, pore space ownership and EPA Class 6 well permit primacy and these kinds of things to open up, what could be, carbon storage projects, whether it's point source capture or DAC, in this study. So, if you'd asked me about political interest in that topic, 10 years ago, I would have, told you pigs would fly before we would be having that conversation, in the legislature, and that's happened. So I do think there's a lot of interest, and I think it speaks to some of the tensions in where the interest in the political leanings of these things come from is, tell me how it's good for our neighborhood. Tell me how it's good for communities and residents here. And it's a conversation we're willing to entertain. The recent, Berkshire Hathaway and titanium cast parts project was announced over in Mason County, largest renewables microgrid demonstration or installation project, I think, in the country, and it's the answer there was, we're interested in this economic development. We're interested in the job creation. The fact that solar is part of the mix is fine. So I think that it comes down to those kind of very fundamental questions of, is it as an economic driver, is their benefit to our community, then the politics start to solve themselves a little bit at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting to see that usually cuts through the ideological tailwinds. Probably not always, but a lot. So let me ask you one other question, and I'm going to move to audience questions. So obviously, anytime we have a discussion of CDR, the issue of moral hazard arises, right? That we're going to take our eyes off the ball of decarbonizing. And I would think if I were looking at this from the outside, there'd be particular concern in a place like West Virginia, where there's a lot of dependence on coal for the economy. That moral hazard concern would be front and center. How would you address somebody challenging a narrative of large scale CDR in West Virginia on those grounds?
You want first crack at that one too, Eddie, or?
No, I think you should go first.
Well, and that is a great, it's a very thorny kind of economic and, kind of philosophical problem. I mean, I think the answer that I've had for that is that we need action and we need impact quickly. And, that's going to be tough to do without some of these technological solutions. I mean, it's, backing off to the political realities of, do you think there's political will for, a carbon tax or a national, renewable production credit or something like that? And I mean, I think you see that gets tough to do. And so you say, okay, what can we do that starts to make impacts quickly? Where can we start to get, millions of tons of carbon managed relatively quickly? And I think at least today, we've got to just say, I'm interested in following all these solutions until they start to, not show feasibility. Again, some of these concepts we're talking about here today with DAC, I mean, it's very early technology. So there's a lot of how much cost can you drive out? Is it a project you could do in the first place? I think that's still an open question technologically. But if we've got options to decarbonize some of these tougher sectors, whether that's power gen, everybody thinks power gen, but we've done a lot of work recently in industrial decarb. How do you get carbon out of steel making and cement and all these things? And it's, having some tools in the toolbox to just do capture and storage, start to simplify that discussion quite a lot. Because at least in our mix, would I rather have a megawatt of solar to offset a coal-fired megawatt, or would I rather have that megawatt of solar for an industrial decarb project? And I think at least today, from a carbon perspective, you want to try to get the electrical grid managed first. And that means you've got to still have these other solutions, in your kit. So that's my opinion. That's a Sam Taylor, not a WVU opinion, but yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, and on the natural climate or carbon dioxide removal solution side, I think on one end there is a fear of greenwashing of companies, buying carbon credits from forest carbon projects and potentially emitting more. But there's also this hidden benefit of us actively managing our land in a more sustainable way. And if we can get money into conservation and sustainable management of forests, there are other co-benefits besides that carbon dioxide removal. There's wildlife benefits, there are water quality benefits, and there's also those economic benefits to small family forest owners in West Virginia that can be really important. And I think the other thing there also, just real quick, is that's why we also really need to be able to verify these things, because there's been a lot of press about how a lot of these carbon projects might not be doing what they say they're doing in forests. And so we need to get rid of that uncertainty, and we need to do the basic science to get rid of that uncertainty.
Yeah, agreed. So let me move to audience questions. First one, are the Power Ventures investors open to supporting a broader CDR tech package within their $3 billion budget, or have they locked down their tech strategy?
I have an answer for that I'm not at liberty to share, just due to some other agreements we've signed. So, familiar with the project and some of the things they've got planned there, but unfortunately can't discuss them in a public forum. Sorry.
Okay, we'll move on. Next question. Biochar was not mentioned in the introduction. It's not the same as BECS. Will there be biochar initiatives in West Virginia?
So the reason we focused on forests primarily is because of, again, it's 75% of our land area. But there is, we have our dominant agricultural use is pasture. And it's kind of low input pasture. And so people more or less let cows out in the landscape and they let them go. So there's a number of ways you can increase soil carbon in those pastures. One way could be just doing simple things like rotational grazing, introducing deeper rooted plant species. You could also think about mixing biochar into those soils. I am not a biochar expert, but there could also be some, you have to think about the life cycle analysis of that too. Like you got to get it to the field, and do you waste more carbon getting it there than you actually stick in the soil? So I think there's still some uncertainty in that.
And Will, I'll toss into the chat. There's a pretty large center here, the Mass Bio. I'm reading it off the website, so I don't have this acronym memorized. Mid-Atlantic Sustainable Biomass Consortium.
Oh yeah,
That's got a pretty significant focus in biochar as well. And so I've just tossed it in our chat that you guys can share. But there's a lot of work in biochar with that particular research effort, and I do think Eddie hit on what one of the bigger issues they're working through with that larger consortium is that, again, in Appalachia, the cost to move biomass around, especially woody waste stuff can start to eat up your benefits pretty quickly. And I know that's a big conversation and concern point for the folks that are working that research today.
okay, thank you. So next question, with respect to carbon credit generation, how do you price in the relative uncertainty and scalability of different carbon removal strategies, such as afforestation has a higher risk of reversal than DACs, for example?
I'm going to punt and say you let the market decide. But again, but I think Sam might have a more informed answer to this, but I think it's really market driven, and it's sort of outside my wheelhouse. I'm not an economist, so I'll see if Sam has a.
Well, and I'm enough of an economist to say like that's a really hairy question in an early market that's not fully fleshed out, right? Trying to put the bars around what's the range of pricing on these things, and that's been something we've talked quite a bit about in the the carbon products markets, and then the value of credits and all these kinds of things, is just that the range is massive. You go from, I'll wave my hands, $10 or $15 a ton in some of these forest carbon projects to folks say need to be $250, $280 a ton for a DAX project. And I'll be honest, I don't know how you frame up value across a market with a 10 and 20 times difference in price for the same commodity across the stack. So I definitely appreciate and understand the question. I'm not there yet in terms of really being able to understand that uncertainty. Someone wants to give us a call and go do a research project, I think we'd love to look at that. But it's it's a very, very tricky thing, just again, given the range of stuff you see in the market today.
And on the forest side, that was another one of the concerns of the lawmakers, is that what if people lock up their forests in a carbon credit project and it's for this price, and then it's a 100-year agreement, and then 20 years later the price is quadrupled or is way higher, and so they've kind of gotten the short end of the stick.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of these questions that you're raising again are just interesting case studies, right? Of the economic and political considerations that are going to be part and parcel in a lot of states, right? That are looking at least on the nature-based side. So that's interesting. Okay, next question. Do land sites of strip mines and mountaintop removal figure at all in your equation? And if so, what specific opportunities might exist in those zones?
So I alluded to that real quickly at the top there. We have a separate project working with Coalfield Development Corp, looking at the southern, going away my hands, 20 counties of West Virginia, where we're actually screening former mine sites for this purpose. We're looking at, any surface mines, and we're trying to run through a screening and evaluation process to say what is sort of your best application on these sites. Whether is it renewable energy production, is it direct air capture installation, is it commercial construction and housing, or is it afforestation and and recreation? Can we build mountain bike trails or something? That works about 6 months in, so it's early days, kind of getting that up and running. But that is part of our bigger evaluation surface we're working on, and hope to have some more substantial results for that in upcoming years. But that's we've started out with what you can find through GIS analysis, looking at land cover data and West Virginia DEP permit work to kind of set the the batch of sites, what are actually the things we're looking at. And then we're starting to work through the different screening evaluation in partnership with industry to say, what's truly a viable solution in this spot, for this parcel. So that's some of the work we're doing right now, and that gets into some pretty tricky things around post-use, post-mining land use considerations, and a lot of private land ownership in the state. I mean, are some parcels that are abandoned mine land or maybe in bond forfeiture. They're a little more straightforward to address, but a lot of these parcels are still in private hands, and understanding how you do that development and what the package is to get the work done is tricky. Anyways, Joan's part of that work with us. Debbie's part of that work with us. So it's going to be some exciting stuff for the next year or two. And again, it's early, but it's on our screen.
Let's see. I think that answered a lot of this one question, but maybe the last part would still be pertinent. What parameters were considered as constraints in the evaluation of the options that you considered?
For mine, that's actually relatively straightforward. Does the geological survey say there's sufficient storage underneath of it? And do I have 100 acres of, clear land cover? Basically, is it a blank slate? Is it a devegetated surface site of 100 acres or more, within a permit boundary? We were just doing a high level technical screening to say, is there even a project to further analyze here? So for us, that was, we made a call about, the socioeconomic realities in the state. We're going to focus on this part of the state. And in the second stage, I won't say it was a simple analysis to do, but it's a simple analysis to talk about, in that, is there storage here? Is there surface area? Where do we overlap? And can we come up with, a set of sites that would give you some confidence to look at further? Eddie, I'll have to defer to you on all the other ones.
Yeah, so for the forest, we followed a framework by Debbie, what's that Lawrence Livermore, the one for California?
I'm
Getting
blanking.
to neutral.
Thank you. Getting to neutral. That's it. Yes.
So
in fact, by the way, there's a webinar that this group did with them a couple of years ago, if somebody wants to watch it.
And so we followed their methodology for the forest, where more or less you take your forested area and your existing timber sink, and then you make an assumption about how forest management would increase that sink over time, and you have some uncertainty involved in that. And there's kind of a time scale of how that goes forward into the future. For the agricultural sink, we used the USDA's Comet Farm model, which is, you can actually go on there yourself and put in a land parcel and say, what will happen to it if I do some regenerative agriculture methods like no-till or plant different species, and you can see what your land would how much carbon would go into the soil. And then for the wetlands, we used there's an existing wetlands map, and then there's a potential wetlands map, and we made some assumptions about what was the pace of restoring the wetlands and how much carbon could you put into those wetlands over time.
Yeah, if I could also add to that, Will, because the first part of the question, as I'm seeing it here, talks about the environmental, economic, and technological parameters. So you might remember I mentioned what I call the 4 E's at the beginning: effectiveness, efficiency, equity, ease, and political acceptability. So if you look throughout the full version of the guide, you're going to see we have a lot of tables. And on those tables, we kind of basically operationalize those. So we talk about science technology. We had one subcommittee that specifically focused on possible ecological impacts. We have one that focused on equity issues. And so you'll see these kind of pro-con tables for each of the different kinds of technology that Eddie and Sam have been talking about, and the pros and cons based on the literature. And I think that was really a key aspect is, so much of, what we see in this field, it always talks about the positive aspects of each of these different technologies, but we all know that, there's a downside to everything. And, based on that, the group decided that it was worthwhile to move forward with all of these. But it's also worthwhile to mention that we did drop one option that at the beginning we thought would work, which is carbon mineralization. And that is because we found out that West Virginia does not have the right geology for it. And at the beginning, I thought that was going to be the thing, right? That was going to, because some people said, "Oh yeah," but it turns out, no, it doesn't. It won't work in West Virginia. And so we talked about it briefly, just to acknowledge that we did analyze it and we did drop it. So all those parameters, were part of our thinking about it. And we didn't really necessarily prioritize the different options. We just basically said, here's what involves, to do each one. And then it'll be up to the policymakers to say, okay, well, are we going to do like we do in energy, sort of an all of the above strategy, or focus on one? And as I think Sam said earlier, all of the above seems to be the best option at this stage.
Okay. Next question. Have there been any deployments of pilot CDR projects of any type in West Virginia? And then the second question, is there any talk of trying to entice startups in this space to begin projects in this state?
So I can do the natural one really quick because I think Sam has a lot longer answer.
Right.
So again, we've had a lot of projects in the California Air Regulatory Board market. So with these 100-year agreements, large landowners, big carbon credit projects in forests. There's also a smaller program called the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is run by the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. And so they're piloting a program to get people with land holdings as small as 40 to 100 acres into carbon credit markets. And I'll let Sam take it from there.
Well, and mine's maybe even easier and faster than Eddie's. So far, at least in the sort of large industrial type approaches, we haven't had any demonstrations or pilots in the neighborhood yet. Though we're getting tire kickers and conversations about them quite a bit. Again, as folks kind of look around the region and say, where do we have storage opportunities and in space to do some of these kinds of projects. So far it's been, talking and feasibility and well, how would it works, but we don't have any real projects in the field spending money yet, I guess is how I would say that.
All right. Tease out energy questions again associated with DACs, right? Because we talked a lot about forests. You've indicated that forests may turn out to be a prickly, challenging issue in West Virginia, and so it makes sense maybe to be looking at some of the industrial options. But DACs obviously requires a large amount of energy, right? Especially in the regeneration process. And you talked about potential sources, including solar and geothermal, but that obviously poses trade-offs, right? When you were talking about electrifying the economy, for example, you could use solar and geo for that, and then not be able to use it for DACs. Do you have any sense that West Virginia has the capability to simultaneously really de-electrify its economy and also have enough spare renewables to drive a direct air capture economy?
Well, and that's a great question. And I think the way you have to think about this a little bit for us is that these things may not be directly connected. In a lot of the screening we're trying to do, again, for the Coalfield Development Project, one of the first screening criteria for renewables deployment is, can I get the thing on the grid? Some of these sites, I may have big land area, I may have, a great site, except there's no grid tie, there's no substation close by. That becomes then kind of a natural fit for this sort of discussion. So, okay, it's a great solar location, but I don't have a grid connection. DAC question mark. So that's sort of some of the screening approach we're taking at this. I do think that, that is a call we have to make again, and we've had a lot of these conversations just internally in my classes and panels around the neighborhood, is that, thinking about how you decarbonize a grid in our state that's 90% coal-fired still, has to kind of be your first lane. If you're really talking about the carbon problem, you can decarbonize lots of other stuff, but, coal-fired generation at peak of 40% efficiency, that's always going to be the elephant in the room until you get that managed. And that's, there's just no way around that. And we're having some conversations with West Virginia DEP and the US EPA around just some of the larger, climate pollution planning discussions that are going on there. Like that has to be addressed, and you have to have an answer for that. And for me, it'd be tough to talk about these other projects where we're just going to stay on coal-fired generation and fire up solar to do something else until we have that solved, or at least have a plan to solve it.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one more question, and this is a thorny one. It's one you address in the report. So I guess maybe if you could drill a bit down more in terms of specifics. So the question is, there's a long history of economic development in West Virginia that benefits large corporations and negatively impacts local communities, wildlife, and ecosystems. How can CDR in West Virginia be done in a way that's just, sustainable, equitable, and profitable?
So
what does this outreach look like?
So can I let me just give a frame to that, and I'll let them drill down. So that is the key essential question, right? And as part of our, as our thinking goes, we're in West Virginia to do good. And we believe that the work that we do can serve the public good. And to do that, especially in a situation with carbon and a state with a history of extractive economy and abuses, we all know those things. And so from the very beginning, we have centered equity. We even had a separate cross-cutting, we had different panels. We had the natural solutions panel and the technological solutions panel. We had a conservation panel, and we had an equity panel from the very beginning, and they were cross-cutting. And throughout, we have had that. And if you look at the guide, you will see from the beginning, we pose equity and conservation questions. There are no simple answers, but because we don't know, there's a lot we don't know, but we're well aware of that. And so I'm going to let now our subject matter experts take over that. But I just want to assure you that if you take a look at our report, you will see that that's our going in position, that this has to be done right. And that in this, I know I'm preaching here, but in this new energy economy that's developing, we have a chance to do it differently. We have a chance to do it in a way that brings jobs and clean water, that you can have economic prosperity and clean air. And that's what we believe. So I'll let the experts take it away now.
I don't know if I have much to add on what Joan said. I think she did a great job. I would just say that's why we focused on small family forest owners. That was why our focus was there. Sam, do you have anything else to add?
And in a similar vein, again, it's kind of like taking the global discussion about sustainability and equitable outcomes, and then saying, well, okay, on the ground, how do you do that? I mean, that drove a lot of our focus into former mine sites and things that may be living in the limbo land for reclamation, versus greenfield construction, and a lot of these sites are, intentionally, when they were doing some of the surface work, a little bit removed from communities, and that, when they were doing it, it was so folks wouldn't come complain. For us, that now becomes a little bit of an opportunity. Again, if we're a little further away, does that, help to address some of these, truck traffic and noise and, industrialization kind of concerns if you're aiming at a place that's already, had a lot of activity and is a little bit distant from some of these communities. But these are, again, as a resident and a native, these are the crux questions. And how do you start to drive, economic models, whether that's in the carbon credit markets or however you want to think about it, we have large landowners here, and it's tough to come after the equitable distribution of outcomes, when, you're in forced carbon market. Well, it's the same, I don't know, half dozen large landowners. How do you get around that? Okay, we're looking at, in West Virginia, carbon storage, the pore space has been by statute allotted to the surface owner. And I think that's a good thing versus the mineral owner, but still it's large surface owners. And so, in the case of a lot of these projects, you're talking about large projects with large partners. How do then the benefits roll down to the community? And those are the conversations we're having real time as you think about the construction and the development of community benefits plans and all these kinds of things as these projects start to stand up. Is what does the community want, and how do we codify, those outcomes for those communities?
And you'll see the policymaker guide does talk about the need for community benefit agreements and these other kinds of activities. So I would encourage anybody who is interested in that topic to take a look at the guide, and they will see, all the different things that we need to think about. But I think these community benefit agreements are really sort of going to be the wave of the future. The challenge will be that in the past, they have not always been applied to energy related kinds of activities. And so it's going to be a new field, for us to figure out what it is versus, like you're building an apartment in a city and they're going to build a park or something. Well, what is it going to be for these communities? That is still yet to be figured out.
All right. We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to thank Deborah and Eddie and Sam and Brooke and Joan for joining us for, I think, a fascinating discussion. As I said, this is obviously pertinent to West Virginia, but it's pertinent everywhere, right? It discusses a lot of the core issues in terms of CDR development, whether it's trade-offs in terms of resources, trade-offs in terms of energy use, questions of monitoring, reporting, and verification, justice issues, right? We're going to have to grapple with these, and individual states are going to help us, I think, as laboratories in figuring out what works and doesn't work. So I'm really appreciative, again, of you producing this report, coming on the webinar and discussing this with us. And once again, thank you to all of our audience members for coming along and your thoughtful questions. And with that, I'll say goodbye and hope that you'll join us for future editions of Scrubbing the Skies. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.